Okay. I'm going to then maximize. I'll show you the assignment. Oh, let's go back. I'm going to go back to here. I think I want to go to settings real quickly and turn it into student view. Go to assignments. The reason I want to do that is students view is actually much more readable when you look at the assignment. Okay. So these are the things that we're going to do. We're going to create a schema. So I need to talk about what schema are, and I'll do that in just a second. Called management schema. And then we're going to create a couple of views that are belong to that schema. We're going to create a role, and we'll give permissions on that role to the management schema, and we'll also give execute permissions to the stored procedure to add an employee. We'll create a new login, and we'll create a new user for that login. We'll add that user to the role, and then we'll do the login just to test it. And then we'll run a couple of queries to see if it works. And then we'll do a backup because it's also good to do backups. I do more of this stuff in the summer, but this is giving you kind of a overview of that kind of thing. So there's a couple of things. Let's go here. Let me zoom this up a little. So if we go, let me just make some notes here that'll be in the script. All right, so there are a couple of things for security and arrangement. One of them we're going to get to there's authentication. You guys know what that means for security? What is authentication?
It's saying, hey, not only do you have the right user ID, you have the proper password, and you have the right access to certain privileges.
Well, yeah, usually so there's two parts to this. One is authentication and one is authorization.
Okay, yeah, I do it.
That's fine. Basically, this is, are you who you say you are? And the typical way to do that is username and password, but there are other ways. So I'll do that, username, password. Windows, we're using Windows authentication right now. You know what that is? This only works on SQL Server, Windows authentication. The Windows user is mapped directly to SQL Server. So when you log into Windows, you're already logged into SQL Server with whatever permissions have been assigned to that user in SQL Server. So you don't have to do a double login. The Windows login is sufficient. That's what we're doing right now. And the way it's set up is that the local Windows user is the administrator for us. Does that make sense? You can also, though, go into Active Directory and you can map. You do have to map them. It isn't automatic. You can map the different users to SQL Server and give them different permission levels, right? They can belong to different roles or things like that. And then they just, whenever they log into a computer, they have those permissions in SQL Server. Microsoft suggests doing this, but it does assume that all of your machines are Windows machines and that you're not coming in through the internet. So if you come in through the internet, then you do SQL Server password, or if you have people on Macs and things like that, which is username and password. Other ways, do you guys know other ways? We're not going to explore these much, but there's certifications. Does anybody know how certifications work? You guys are quiet today. Basically, you go buy a cert, and the cert actually says you are who you say you are, and they're assuming you wouldn't have paid for that if it wasn't true. And there are certain places where you buy them that supposedly they verified your who you are before they gave you the certificate. You can also, again, we're not going to do this, but you can do it by key encryption. So you can log in based on a key. The key can't be on the same computer as your database. So typically it's on a thumb drive, which to me is just real. Thumb drives are so easy to lose. When you plug in the thumb drive, the key that decrypts the database is there. That's your authorization. But you're not allowed to keep the key on the same drive as the database. So we're going to look mostly at username and password, which is that authorization is giving permissions. And Windows, SQL Server has a really fine-grained list of permissions. If you go into something like MySQL, they're really broad. You can read the database or you can't, basically. In MySQL, you can say you can see this column but not this column. I mean, you can get really fine-grained. I would argue that generally you don't want to do that. You need to create like bulk permissions, and we'll talk about that. Part of permissions, there's two different things. We're going to talk about schema, and schema is a really overused word. So what are some of the meanings of schema? Anybody know? When you talk about database schema, you're usually talking about
the database structure.
The structure, right? And next class, we'll talk about XML schema, which is related in a way because it's an XML document that describes the structure of another XML document. In this case, where we're in terms of authorization, we're going to talk about schema in terms of object ownership. So you've encountered one schema already a lot. Remember when we do our tables and things, let's go over here. When we look at them all, they all have DBO in front of it. DBO is a schema. DBO is an ownership of objects. All these objects are owned by the schema DBO, which is database owner, right? So it's the default owner, the default schema. But you can make other schema, and you can make it, and what happens when you make schema, if you don't have permissions on that schema, when you log in, you don't get to use or see the objects. Does that make sense? So you can create different schemas for different people. Like you might create a schema for human resources that has all these different views and things, which is what we're going to do for human resources. And when they log in, they can only see the things in their schema. This is ANSI standard, although other databases handle it differently. Typically, when you log in, anything you create under your own login is in your schema. So I'll show you some examples of that. And then the very last thing are roles. Roles are collections of permissions. And it's really important that you should assign permissions to roles and then assign people to roles. It's much better to do that than assign permissions to individual users. Does that make sense? Because you can just, if a person quits, you don't have to go undo their permissions. You just remove them from the role, right? It's a lot simpler maintenance. Different, usually there'll be several people that have several similar needs, so you can put them into a role. The other thing I will real quickly under authorization here, and then I'll quit talking and we'll do this. There are logins and users. So logins log into the server, and users are mapped to a particular database. So you always log into the server, and then the user is that login mapped to a particular database. Does that make sense? When you log into say SQL Server, you don't necessarily have instant access to all the databases, right? You only have databases where your login is mapped to the database. So just real quickly, you might notice that there's a security out here and there's a security here. This is database security and this is server security. And under the server security, there are, I hit the wrong thing, server objects. There are logins. Okay, and then under the database security, there are users. Okay. So we're going to go through, first we'll make a schema, then we'll make a couple of objects to belong to the schema. Then we'll create a role. We'll add some permissions to it, and then we'll make a login and a user, and then assign the user to the role. Does that make sense? Then we'll test it. So that's sort of the big picture. I know I don't usually lecture in here in the sense of actually talking about, I usually just show you the code. Any questions on that before I go ahead? So if we looked at the assignment, it said to create a management schema. I'm literally, this is how easy it is. Create a schema, and I'll just call it management schema. That's all there is to creating a schema. Just going to highlight that. I'm going to execute it. If you want to see where that is, if you look under security in the database, you'll see that there's schemas. Is this too small to read? Do I need to zoom more?
Can you go up and try to see the
So it's just create schema and give the schema a name. And there's a folder called schemas. And there's a lot of pre-built schemas, but we have management schema in there now. So I'm going to create a simple view. Actually, I'm not sure it was a simple view the way I set it up. And just look at the assignment. I think the views I had were like annual ridership is a little bit, we could do that. So create a couple of views. So I'm going to go back. I think it'll want to go. I'm going to create view, and I'm going to do management schema dot, and I'll call it VW annual ridership. So before I go on, this is what makes it belong to a schema. You know how we did all of them have DBO by default? This one won't have DBO. It'll have management schema as the schema. So it'll belong to a different schema. It's not DBO now. And I'm going to just say select count writers actually, I probably want year before that. Where is the it's bus schedule assignment date, right? Okay, it's not super important that this be good, but we're going to do this from bus schedule assignment. Would help if I could type. Is that right? Why is bus schedule assignment date still? Oh well. Inner join writers, ridership, and let's alias this BR on B dot bus schedule. I don't know why this is giving me, doesn't like bus schedule assignment date. Why? Bus schedule assignment. Oh well. On bus schedule assignment key. Yeah. Did I spell something wrong or?
Yeah.
What? Oh, you know what? That's what it is. Or R dot. That should work. I'm going to try this just to make sure that works. Oh, I have to group by. Okay, so that should work. Yeah. It's interesting that 2013, 2014 have exactly the same number of writers. So anyway, I'm going to make that view. Didn't I make the management schema? I did. Did I spell it wrong? Man, yes, I did. Okay, so it's successful. And if I look under views, I have the management schema. You guys should have more because you guys did other views, right? But I have the management schema dot VW annual ridership.
The bus schedule, it's not saying R dot bus schedule assignment key invalid column name.
Maybe do a dot. Is that the one I spelled wrong? Yeah, it looks like it's right. Bus schedule
Oh, let me do
assignment.
another search. No bus schedule assignment day. Yeah, I got what's total riders. I got bus schedule assignment. We got these are uppercase.
That shouldn't matter.
Okay. So enjoy ridership R on B dot bus schedule equals R dot bus schedule assignment key. Group by
There's a missing N.
Oh, right, there's a
Schedule.
missing N in the
Yeah,
second
second
one.
schedule.
Assignment. Get rid of the N on this one.
oh, okay.
I knew that one of them, and I knew it was in ridership as misspelled. I should correct that.
Oh, it's okay.
It's only in the one. Don't get rid of it everywhere.
That's why in ridership.
It's only in ridership.
Okay, yeah, it goes away. Right.
Okay, so we have that. And I'm going to do one other quickie view, just so we have a couple of things in the schema. So this is owned by Management Schema, right? So when we log in, actually as database owner, we can see this. Database owner can see everything. But when we log in later, we will be a member of the schema. We won't be able to see the DBOs. We'll only be able to see the management schema. So I'm going to do another view real quickly. It'll just be a simple create view, and then it's management schema dot. Let's just do VD. I'm going to call it employee info. If you did a different view with that name or something, well, it wouldn't be under management schema, but if you did another view with that name, you might change that. I'm just going to select from employee pretty much all the columns. I'll break that down a little bit though. What? You know, I'm not sure why mine aren't bracketed. It shouldn't matter, right? The only other thing I'm going to do is I'm also going to bring in like employee position. I'll bring in the hourly. I'm going to say position name. And I'll bring in the hourly pay rate. It's interesting, if I drag them in one at a time in mine, they are square bracketed. And the date the position was assigned. So I need to do several joins. I'm going to do from employee E, join employee position, EP, on E dot employee key equals EP dot employee key. And then I'm going to join again. And I'm leaving the inner out on purpose just to show you that it can be done. Position P on P dot position key equals EP dot position key. Okay. So if I'm going to test the query, that's a lot there with the way I broke it up, but ambiguous column. Let's yeah, we probably do want their key. So I'm going to do E dot employee key. All right, so there's the information. And it has, if we go down here, it has their position and their hourly pay rate and the date that they were assigned. So basically, it's just a view that gives you all the employee information. What do you need on that?
For just a minute.
Yeah. The join part. And you can do inner join if you prefer. Joins are assumed to be inner joins, unless you specify otherwise. This is the last object we're going to make to belong to the schema. This is most of the stuff you've done before, although I know I'm doing it fast. It's probably faster than you used to. Yeah.
So I'm having some issues here. So why did it create schema?
So do E dot employee key if you use it as
Oh, okay.
Because it's an ambiguous column. It's a notable.
Okay, that's a good. Now for the management schema, I created it, but where is it at?
So it's actually stored. If I come over here, it's under security. And so if we go under security, I'm looking for the security folder. There's roles and there's schemas, and the management schema is in here. So the security folder for the database, and then under schemas.
Well, when I was going through there, when I did the create view,
You might,
okay, all right, maybe it's one that you can't do twice, but
yeah, I don't think you can do it twice, but so you might have to refresh over here.
okay.
Like, so if I'd have to refresh the views, not the system views, just views. And then, oh, have I made this view yet? I don't think I've made it yet. I've just done the. So then I have to go over here and refresh the views to see the new view.
Okay, I see.
Things that happen here are not necessarily reflected over here right away. Actually, the same is true the other way. Sometimes you can create something over here and it'll still claim it doesn't exist over here, but it'll function just fine. All right, so those are the two things that we're going to make to belong to the schema. That's all we're going to make to belong to the schema. So I'm going to create a role called, I'm going to create a role called management role. And we'll assign it to the schema table. It's not coming up.
How did you get this schedule assignment?
Okay,
I can come over there.
yeah, so I had it highlighted, so these are spelled correctly. It's just that the ridership one, the R, has bus schedule missing in between the G. So that's the thing, it's just this type of. Because I need to stay awake. It's up at school, I got real life to deal with. Harlow wouldn't solve my problem. Okay, so let's assign it to.
Must be some.
Hold on. Back for a second. Let's see. Security. So the Metro All, that's security, I don't. So there's management. See, if he's having a problem with this, so he's got like red lines here.
So create views. And then you track management schema, right?
Yeah.
Let me do this. Let me just try this. This is always been delete.
I actually made this management schema like outside of the scared first.
Okay. So, but let's see if that does. Oh, you need to use Metro All.
But it's in Metro All.
Humor me. Humor me. Okay, so now let's create your schema. Okay, so refresh. Okay, so there it is. Okay, we still have that line style. Create key methods.
So go ahead and create it. Just, yeah, go over down. Just do,
Okay.
okay, so what is here?
Line 10.
Right. Oh, so yeah, don't have this.
Line 16.
Oh, you're right, so you have the select, you can't have those selects.
Okay.
So just run,
Oh, okay. You just. Oh, okay. That's just for verify.
Yeah, that would be good.
alright, so it doesn't drive,
Let's schedule.
oh, you know what, it's not from the schedule assignment, it's just the assignment. No, this that one is good,
This one here.
that's correct.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yep. All right. Thanks, Mike. Oh, you want to?
Yeah, so change that now, I'm gonna do a roll, we'll let you get back to your seat. So, and I will post this too if you need to catch up on it. So what we've done so far, we created a schema, we created two objects to go in the schema. So I'm going to create a role, and it's just as easy as all the others. I'm just going to say create role, and I'll call it management role. So schemas are collections of objects. Roles are collections of permissions. So this is actually all there is to creating a role. You just create role, give it a name.
That's it.
That's it. So, but I have to assign some permissions to it
Okay.
next, right?
Oh, okay. I knew there was a catch.
Yeah. So when we go into down here, right above the schemas folder, there's a roles folder. And if you look, the roles and the schemas are pretty close. If we look at the database roles, they're fairly similar to the schemas, but we've got the management role right added. I find the built-in roles way too general for most things. So, for instance, data writer, that means you can write to any table. If you assign somebody to that role, they can write to literally any table in the database. Data reader means they can read everything in the database. The only times I find those really useful is when I'm testing, right? When you're making a test, you sometimes just quick assign those two roles, and then you can read and write in any table. But for real life, you usually don't want people to have that much scope, that much permission. All right, so having created the role, I am going to assign some things. So I'm going to grant select on, I think I have to do, see if I remember how to do this schema. I believe that is correct. So I'm going to grant select on schema, and I'm going to grant, so select on schema to management role. And I'll grant execute on, I think it was USP, I think it's DBO, USP, add employee, whatever you named yours, if you have it. to management role. So if I got these right, we're granting the permission to select the views that we created in the, for the management schema. So we're granting select on schema, and we're granting exec. But you can also, if it were, you can grant other things. The kinds of things that you can grant, I'll just do a quick comment here. You can grant select, update, delete, insert, alter, create. Those are basically and drop. Those are basically the permissions. Looking for that. Does that make sense? Those are the kinds of things you could do. And if I wanted to grant select and update, I could do it like that. Right. So you can grant more than one in a single statement. Update doesn't make sense. Update wouldn't work on these views. So do I want to leave that there?
Steve, I didn't have a USB added for you.
Right. So whatever your stored procedure is.
Okay, I don't think I've done that yet. So.
Yeah, if you haven't done it, just skip that for right now.
Yeah.
It's just so we're adding these two things to management role, and it works successfully. So generally, you never deny permissions, you just grant permissions. Anything you don't have granted to you is denied by default.
So the double colon.
That's a weird little bit that only applies to schema. I wondered why, where that comes from. I think is C++. It's a membership operator. I don't know why it's made its way into SQL, but underneath it all, SQL Server and most relational databases are just C++ doing all sorts of complicated things with lists, and data structures. So one of the things I'm going to show you, just to show you, so we've got this role now. So I'm going to look at the properties of the role, and I might zoom up a little bit more for this. Is this a zoomer that I have? Yeah, it only goes up 150. So this is the role. When it says own schemas, it doesn't really own any, but when I look at securables, it's got the management schema there, and it's got USP add employee. And if you go down, so it's on management schema there. If I go down here, it has check marks in update and select. Those are the permissions that it's granted. Obviously, you could do all this graphically, but it's actually easier to do it in code, in SQL.
So how do you get to that dialog box again?
So the way I got here is I went to the role, management role. I right-clicked it and I looked at the properties. And then I was looking at securables. For the stored procedure, if I click it, then the execute is checked. And again, the general rule is you only have permissions that you're granted. Anything that you're not explicitly granted, you are denied. This has a deny column, which is not ANSI standard for SQL. There is no deny in SQL standard. Because of that fact, if you aren't given it, you're denied it. There is a with grant. What that means is if you were in the middle of a stored procedure and you don't have permissions to do something, but the person that created the procedure has permission, they could grant the user permission for the length of that stored procedure to do something. Does that make sense? So somebody that has the permission can grant somebody without it permission for the length of a transaction if they have the with grant checked. I usually don't do that, but that's what that means. And you can see most of the permissions are, as I said. Again, you can do all this. You could do all this. You can create a role. You can assign permissions, everything graphically. But I think this is faster. All right, so we've gotten permissions on the role. What we're going to do now is we're going to create a user, a login and a user, add the user to the role, and then we'll test it. Does that make sense? So I'm going to create a login. And it's really, these things are really simple. I'm going to create login. I'm going to say what the login name is. Ideally, what I would do is look at one of the employees and see who's in the management role. Anybody know any employee that's in the management role? I don't even remember any employees. You don't have to do this. I'm just going to choose an employee, whether they're a manager or not. So I think I'm going to just choose Elizabeth Adams. So I'm going to just do E. Adams. Let's make it a capital. E. Adams is her login name. And we're going to just do with password equal, what do you want to do it as, password? Okay. We're not sure about this part, so it's not complete. Yeah, it doesn't look, maybe I don't quote that. Okay. Doesn't seem to be complaining. Let's try that. It worked. Okay, so there's the login. So their password is password. There's all sorts of parameters you could set there. Like, is that password going to have to be changed? Luckily, it didn't complain about it not fitting the criteria. But their default database will be Metro Alt. So just to show you where that goes, I'm going to go down here. And this is security on the server. So this is not inside the database. This is on the server. And there are logins, and I need to refresh. So when I refresh, there's EA Adams. And if I look at the properties, you'll see that it's EA Adams. It has a password. It has server roles. Right now, only public because we haven't assigned them to anything. User mapping, I don't know that it mapped to anything. In general, does it say what are, yeah, default database Metro Alt, default language English, etc. It says to enforce password policy, but it didn't. Right now, E. Adams, again, they belong to the public. Everybody belongs to the public, and you can't change that, but the public has 0 permissions. So the only permission that the public has is to connect. So right now, eAdams could connect to the server, but they couldn't look at any database. They can't do anything. Does that make sense? They have 0 permissions. So I am going to create a user in Metro Alt that corresponds with eAdams. So I'm going to create user. Do we want the same name or do we want it? They can have the same name, although it could be for login eAdams. They could be different names too. So we're creating a user, and one of the things to be sure of is that you're still in Metro Alt, which we are. For the login, we're creating a user that's mapped to that login. So I'm going to run that. If I go up to the database again, under security, there are users. And if I right click and refresh, there's eAdams as a user. She still has no permissions. She has a permission to connect to the server and to connect to the database. That's all she can do. She can't read anything. She can't write anything. She can't do anything. But she can connect. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add eAdams to the management role. So there's a stored procedure for this, but let me see if I can remember. Alter role. I don't know if I have to alter role, management role. Add member. I don't know if I have to alter the role. It is not complaining. Is that going to work? Yes, that worked. I'm proud of myself. I usually forget that line. I think I usually forget to do alter role, and that's the problem. So let's look at the role, management role. I'm going to look at the properties, and it has as a member eAdams. So she has been joined as a member of the role. By adding her to the role, that means that she has permissions now to select on the management schema items and to run the stored procedure. That's all the permissions that she has. Those are the ones that belong to that role. Now, a couple of things about this whole process. I'm kind of just going through and we're just kind of making this up as we go for the permissions and things. This should take a lot of thought, right? We're not giving it a lot of thought, but it should take a lot of thought. You need to, when you design these roles and these schema, figure out exactly what each kind of employee needs to do their job. What permissions do they need? What kind of objects do they need to be able to see? There's a lot of planning and thinking here before you actually go about and do these things. So we should be able to log in with eAdams, except for one thing. So this is part, it is doable in SQL, but I'm going to do it graphically. So I'm going to right click on the top at the SQL Express, and I'm going to go down to properties. Okay. And I'm going to click on security. Notice that it's set to Windows authentication. The thing is, we just did a SQL Server authentication. We did a username and password. Right now, it only accepts Windows authentication. So we need to allow it to accept SQL Server and Windows authentication. So you just click that other radio button. But it's going to require, as it says right here, that we're going to have to restart the server. If you don't do this, when you try to log in, it just won't work. Won't tell you why it won't work, but it won't work. So I'm right-clicking on the server again. I'll go through this a couple of times. There's a restart right here. Right, so you come down here and just choose restart. This could be a problem if you're in production. So you want to think about this again before you ever put it out there. What kind of logins do you want? So I'm going to restart. So it says, yes, I got to do that. And there will be another warning, yes. And then it will restart. It's taking a while. Hopefully it won't take too much longer. Closing the management studio does not restart the server. Right? It's only if you do. Come on, do this. Be a bit of a pain if it fails. Restart already. This usually takes 2 seconds. Why is it hanging there so long?
Is there a dialog box up in the upper left? It's not mine.
I did that one. Oh, yeah. That's what it was. I just wasn't seeing the... I thought I did hit that one already. Okay, so it's been restarted. Hopefully this is still connected. Although it doesn't really matter. All right, so my SQL Express, notice everything is closed back up into folders because it did it. So I'm going to make a new connection. I'm not going to close this connection. I'm going to leave it open. I'm going to connect to the database engine. And what I did is I literally just hit the connect word up there. I'm connecting to a database engine. It's still going to be SQL Express, but instead of Windows authentication, I'm going to do SQL Server authentication. The login is eAdams, and the password was password. Okay, so I'm going to connect. And notice I have two connections now. So do you want me to do that again? So connect, database engine. I did eAdams, and then I did my password, which was just password. I'm not going to connect a third time, which I could, but.
See, when, so I'm trying to make this right now. So when we go through we set the server properties, click OK. Why is it, what you have to click again to go into restart that?
So once you've reset it, so you go to security, you change this, you do OK, it says you have to restart. So then you right click on here and you do restart.
Okay, it didn't prompt you to restart.
It didn't prompt you to restart? Let's see what your properties are. You do that and then do OK.
I'll just restart.
Yeah, just to be sure. Now you only have to do this once. Yes.
Oh, you have to only restart the SQL Server, not the VMware.
Right. Yeah, you don't have to start the VMware. You don't have to restart Management Studio. You only need to restart the server, and you only need to do it once, and it will have that property from now on, right, until you go in and change it again. All right, and then, as I said, then what you do is you connect again. connect to the database engine. Instead of Windows authentication, we do SQL Server authentication, eAdams, the password, and connect. You can have as many connections open here as you want. Okay, it can get a little confusing, but it's really nice to have, like, this is the admin and this is the eAdams, because if there's something wrong with the eAdams, if you're testing it, then you can go back up to the admin and make changes, right? Whereas if you're just in eAdams, you're not going to have much that you can do. So I'm going to just real quickly, I'll open the databases. I can see all the databases, right? But if I click on Community Assist, it says that it's not accessible. I can't get into Community Assist because I don't have permissions. If I go to Metro Alt and open that, when I look under Tables, I see nothing. When I look under Views, I can see the management schema views because I'm part of the management schema, right? I have permissions on those. So those are the only things I can see because those are the only things I have permissions on. If I do a new query, and I'm going to do a new query from, I'll just do Metro Alt here. This is the part that can be a little bit hard. It's keeping track of, notice it says up at the top, eAdams. So it tells me in this tab whose permissions I'm under. In the other tab, I'm under the Winter 18, the admin at things. So if I do select star from, let's do the annual ridership. And run that. I'm only in Metro Alt here yet. It gives me, I can see that, right? If I do select star from employee, it tells me that the permission is denied on the object employee. And I can't actually see that object anyway. I'd have to know it was there because it's not visible in my thing. So questions on that? These are just within, she has very limited permissions. Yeah.
Certainly you don't get the same error message for something that's not there versus something restricted.
Well, so if we did employees, let's see what error we get because there's no invalid object name. Whereas if I do employee, it just says permission denied.
You can still spawn the database to get something.
Yeah. Oops, that's because I did M. Yeah, select permission was denied on the object employee. All right. Well, I just did a select on one we have permissions on and a select on one we don't have permissions on. As I said, the hard part of this, and it is really hard, something you'd have to think about for quite a while, is what permissions do people really need to do their job. You want to make sure, if you're an administrator, that people have all the permissions that they need to do their job, but no more. You don't want to give them extra permissions. Right now, eAdams could barely function, I think. So I think there's only one more thing left, which is like a backup and restore.
I was thinking about doing that example you brought here. So I'm in the I don't think you are. Okay, so Okay, yep, because, oh. So how do I just,
So go down here
uh,
and then,
so disconnect and-
not disconnect, you want a new clip.
Yeah, nuclear. Oh, okay.
See,
I
that
did.
says Adams,
got
that
it,
one said
yeah,
Winter.
Yep.
So you were querying under the admin, even though this was up. And I said, can get really confusing which permission you're under.
And that's.
Yeah. Does it not have any permissions to that?
It doesn't have to be you are showing.
Let's look at the other.
I did not do this.
You didn't run them?
Oh, I didn't.
They have to run. That's what gives the permissions.
Because I haven't used the.
Yeah,
I'm still getting that error. I'm on the EAN's tab.
right.
Do I need to use the Metro Alt?
That's fine. So, Sarah, did you add them to the manager schema? When you look under Metro Alt, and you look under these. Oh, they're showing them.
Oh, shit.
You should be able to select them. Looks like you've already done it.
Let's try that. Okay, let's attack the one. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
They have to run together. And they run.
you can run them separately.
Yeah. Don't have permission. Yep.
It might have to refresh on the other side too. But yeah, without those permissions,
I have to add time.
yeah, these are the permissions. These have to run or there's no.
But
And you also have to make sure you add her to the role. Yeah. Okay.
I just didn't put the my service.
Yeah. Well, the store procedure doesn't matter so much.
Oh, but like run it, it say it does not exist.
Right. Well, you may not have a
I have to use
USP.
mine, right?
What?
I have to use my stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, that's making sense.
Okay. So other questions on those? Does that kind of make sense? It's just a really quick overview of a lot of stuff, right? So the schema is a collection of objects. We made a couple of objects that belong to a different one than the DBO management. We created a role. A role is a collection of permissions. We gave it a couple of permissions. And then we created a login. The login is a server level. And then we created a user that's mapped to that login. This one is inside of Metro Alt. And then this is, we altered the role to add EA Adams as a member. Then I think, and we want to do this is another time, pay attention where you are, because we want admin for this. I think the last thing, let me look at the assignment. We did all of these, so it's just a matter of backing up the database. And we're going to back it up, I think. All right, let me go back here. I actually think I want to go into the C drive. This is in the virtual machine. I'm just going to make a folder called backup. There is a place where it goes by default, but it's a long, hairy path. And I just want to say C:backup. Does that make sense? I just don't want to have to write a long thing. So I'm just going to say backup database Metro Alt to, and I may have to look this up. That's not right. Let me just look real quickly because it's been a while since I did a backup. I tend to cheat on backups. I tend to.
Will it automatically create the recursive path when you do this command invocation, or you have to create backup in Metro Alt before you do this?
We have to create.
Okay.
We have to create the files. That's why I was saying just give me a second so that I can. Oh, that's big. I'm just going to check on the syntax. I believe disk is what I want. That's with multiple files, I think. I think we would, yeah, I think it's just this simple, actually. It's just 2 disk is what I was missing. And then you do the path, single quote, C:\\, backups. I did do backups and not backup, didn't I? Backup. I think that'll back it up. It backed it up successfully. And if I go to that folder again and I go into backups, you'll see that there is a backup file. A couple of things about this: you should never do a backup on the same disk as the database. Because if your disk fails, you're just screwed then. You would want to. Now we could try a restore. The only trouble is if we screw up on the restore, Metro Alt may not be usable.
So this is a binary file.
Yeah,
if you need, if something got bad, you can come back to this.
Yeah, and you could restore the database up to the point, the state where it was when you did the backup. Now we could also back up the log. So this is actually just storing the data file. You can do a separate backup. So I think it's backup. I don't know if it's backup log, but Metro Alt to disk, and you can back up the log file. I'm not sure of the syntax to that back. What? Should. You can actually, so if the database is totally gone, you can recreate it from the. So log isn't correct. Backup database, backup.
Click on the see more. Click on the see more tab.
It's still just doing the.
Yeah.
This is because it's across multiple
Yeah.
disks. which ours is not. All right, just give me the code. Boy, that's big. So it's just backup log. Oh, but in the database name. Okay. So this would back up the log. Ah, it doesn't like that. Oh, the database is set to simple. I never talked about that, but if we look at the properties of the database, files, is it files? No. Options. The recovery model is simple. There's 3 recovery models. There's full, bulk logged, and simple. If it's simple, then you just have your backup, right? And if you're only as good as your last backup, and you can only restore from the backup. If it's full, it logs every transaction. So you can restore from your backup, and then you can restore the log to return all the transactions after the last backup. Bulk log is basically the same thing as full, except it ignores bulk. If you do bulk inserts, like if you insert from a big file, which can happen, it'll ignore those. I think on the assumption that you could always restore them by just reinserting from the files. Logs can get quite big, but I would usually use full backup. This is just simple because it's the way it came down, and we never checked it. But that's why it didn't like the backup log. But I'll leave it there because that's the syntax for it. If you restore the database, it's really just restore database Metro Alt. I think it's from disk equals.
Yeah, it's not letting me do it.
What, the restore?
No, the bulk log.
It won't. I didn't run. I ran that and got an error. The save log. We have to change the mode of the database if we're going to do that, which I could do, but
Is there a reason you wouldn't ever want to always do full for that option?
because the log file can get gigantic. The other thing, though, is you should do, and if your database doesn't change much, so if the database is changing a lot, I would do it. But if it's a database that's mostly like lookup, values that don't change very often, then a backup might be sufficient. But if you're doing regular transactions and those transactions are important, I would certainly do full. Does that make sense? Trying to think of the restore. There's one other phrase before I run that. So let me look here. Because restore is a little complicated sometimes. T-SQL is Microsoft's flavor of SQL. Yeah, that's what I have. All right, let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, it can be a pain to fix. But So you guys may not want to do this, but just to do the restore real quickly. Oh, it's because it's in use. I would have to say use master. And I'd also have to disconnect the, I don't know that this can do that. I don't know that I have permissions to change. It did, okay.
Oh, so all open query.
Yeah, I can't have anything open
Okay.
to it.
Oh, wow.
And it did, it restored it. Good. Not that there's any difference between our backup and our restore because we did it with not doing any changes in between. But yeah, every open connection to the database has to be closed before you to do a restore. If the restore fails, it will look kind of like this. I don't know why that has in recovery. And you will be unable to use it.
Hey,
I have fixed it before. I don't know why this is in recovery. That's interesting. There's no backup there, so I don't know how I'm going to fix that.
well, Steve, this would be useful, right, in case, because you probably don't have some model, hopefully we wouldn't have one model database through departition, like.
Right. You saw some of
that way
the.
You can restore only that part.
Uh,
And the scripts, and actually scripts could do that too, without having to do any intervention.
yeah. Although if you have it stripped across multiple disks, you have to restore from all those disks. Yeah, I don't know that you can restore only a part of it. You can though with the log if you're logging. A lot of things there's no recovery. Like if you say you did an update and you changed everybody's name to Smith, right? And you hadn't done it within the framework of a transaction, right? You're basically screwed. So the only thing you could do is you could restore your backup, assuming you had one, and restore the log, assuming you're doing full thing, up until the moment before you did your mistake. You can restore a log up to a moment in time. So you could recover as long as you had a backup and as long as you were doing full recovery for that. So if I go to MetroAlt, it's really easy to change that. I mean, literally, you just go to change it from simple to full, and now you'll be logging stuff. And that one doesn't require a restart. Anything. There's other options you can do with this. I do this more in the summer class, but just to let you know, and then we'll call it good. This doesn't complete backup of everything, but you can do partial backups. What you have to do a complete one first, but after that you can do backups of only things that have changed since the first one. Does that make sense? You can do incremental backups.
So if this is a three binary file, you're technically always one bit click away from it being binary.
It's binary partially because they don't want anyone to be able to read it.
But would it make sense to also regularly export all the data out into some other format?
So when they're doing these, there are things you can do. Again, this is more advanced, but it's fairly typical to have at least 2 servers in sync. And one of the ways you do that is log shipping. So the first thing you have to do is a full backup like this, and then you copy the full backup to the other server, and then you your logs, and you save the logs fairly frequently, and then you ship the logs to the other server. So if this server were to die, then you would restore the backup and restore the logs, and you would have a database that was in sync with the one that just died. Does that make sense? So log shipping it's actually the cheapest, but not necessarily the most effective way to do that. It's the cheapest because it only takes 2 computers, and you're just shipping the logs. There's other things like there's mirroring. You heard of that? That takes 3 computers. So you have 2 computers that are in sync, and you have a third computer that's just pinging the other 2. All right, so one is the primary, one is the secondary, and one is the sentinel, or whatever. So it's constantly pinging it. If the main machine dies, so it doesn't receive a ping back, it immediately activates the secondary machine, so that and that way it's a failover with no pause, basically. There's no difference between, the customer wouldn't even know that a computer went down. That's expensive because it takes 3 computers for every, database. There are other things you can do too. Failover, actually that's a big topic because computers are up 24/7 these days, databases. They used to be able to take them down at 3 in the morning to do maintenance, but that's almost impossible now. But with that mirror thing, you can take one offline to do maintenance. It doesn't have to just die, and it will automatically launch the other one, and then you can restore that one. But yeah, you're right. You want to. Usually, they keep at least 2 computers with things, and if you're a really big company, you might stretch the log shipping to the extent that you're shipping your logs to Singapore or somewhere. Right, so that if you have an earthquake in Seattle and your computers are destroyed, it's still running just from another location somewhere safe in the world. And if your Singapore thing got flooded out with a tsunami, then your Seattle one could take over. And typically, the big companies will spread these copies across data centers around the world. That's part of what the cloud is too. They just copy your data. Some of them will tell you you have choices if you want just 1 region or 2 or 3 regions for your copies. Well, you could. So if you have your backup and restore, you can always, worst case scenario, delete the database and restore you can create the database from the backup. If you're a small business, then you usually do your backups and you put them onto a removable drive or something, and then take the drive and put it in a fireproof box somewhere, and just do that every day. Maybe you have 2 or 3 that you swap out. That's the real low-end tech of it, But
that's why AWS is so appealing, because
right, you can back up to the AWS. Right. Although
and the price, it's a whole price point thing, right? So you want, it's a little costly, but
if you put your databases, like for businesses, if you put your databases on the cloud, all the maintenance, all the backups and restores are on them. Right, so that's a service that they provide you. It costs money, right? And you have to trust them. And historically, with databases, although this is changing, the trust wasn't there. So one of the things that they would use the cloud for with databases is capacity. So if you're a retail business, 11 months out of the year, you're running at one level, and then all of a sudden at Christmas, you need twice your capacity. To buy all the capacity you need for that 1 month is really expensive, and you're wasting it. It's just lying idle the rest of the year. So one of the things that people have done is they expand into the cloud for for Christmas, And then when Christmas is over, they bring all the data back and close out the cloud account for a while.
But I think the trust is kind of like now it's still like
The trust is getting more.
so
And
now it's still like the subways were coming out in Boston and the whole world that it's like, oh, it's undead, it's underworld. And then after a year, like, oh, this guy is in the subway.
they also do. So the trust is there a little bit better, and also just the cost of it is getting to be, the scale is, it's cheaper on the cloud in general than it is to maintain your own.
It's maintaining on it, you do it, but but because the cost has gone way down because of Moore's law for software and hardware, it's why do the headache? When, it's kind of like why fork a milk car when you go chicken?
Yeah,
$30, but you get back freedom and time.
and you don't have to dispose of the oil.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to get that elbow ding and scrape on the knee and this and that and the other.
So this is SQL Query 2. No, SQL Query 1. I'm just saving the file to, I'll call it admin SQL. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to post it to Canvas rather than to the blog, just because this is the actual assignment and I don't want it there for next quarter. I suppose I could delete the blog after a bit, but so let's go back to stored procedures. Boy, that's huge. Let's unzoom. So the next time we will
What does send it to SQL file, right?
What?
Have the master flow and then the one that tests out for PA.
Yeah, but there's not much on that one. Do you need that one too?
Oh, no, I mean, I'm just wondering. So.
I was just going to do the one that we did all the name. Am I still in student view? So I'm going to put it in files. Yeah, I'm still in student. Leave student view. All right. So I'm going to upload it. It's not in just ridership. Oh, it's in SQL Server Management Studio, Admin SQL. So it's there. It's Admin SQL, but it's there now. So it's there for you to look at. And in the video, which I haven't killed yet, will be, I'll just leave it and I'll put it in the